Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. I was reading something actually today on Substack Notes where someone noted that comedians are our modern prophets. My response to that was, huh. Now, I'm just a simple pastor. I'm not a Bible scholar, but when I read the prophets in the Bible, they don't tend to be the type of people that are really popular, and they definitely don't tend to be the people that get lots of laughs. Most of the time, they don't want the job, and actually, they seem to be hated by, everyone. But I've noticed for years, whenever that word prophetic is used, it's almost always about people who like something that someone says. And being that I'm a part of a mainline Protestant denomination, a lot of, at least pastors and a lot of people in the denomination tend to lean left, the word prophetic is almost always applied to people who are politically progressive. I almost never hear it applied to a moderate or a conservative. And so that always brings up the question, what does it mean to be prophetic? Returning guest Ryan Self argues that maybe we need to better understand the meaning of a prophet, especially in these days of social media influencers. Self wrote a 2-part series on his Substack back in April that's titled Preachers, Prophets, and Politicians. And I want to share a quote actually from his first essay, and I think it kind of sums up what these two articles are talking about. He says, "A prophetic voice is not simply one that speaks passionately about injustice. It is one that speaks truth consistently, even when that truth is uncomfortable for its own audience. Your willingness or not to criticize your own side shows whether you are being prophetic or just partisan." So today, I'm going to talk with Ryan about what it means to be prophetic, what it means to have a prophetic voice. Before we go into that conversation, a little bit about Ryan. Ryan is a communications professional in Austin, Texas. He is a native Texan and has what I think is a very good Substack called Ryan's Boring Book Club, where he writes on culture, politics, and, yes, book reviews. So, here is my conversation with Ryan Self. All right, Ryan, it is good to have you back. And I wanted to talk to you about 2 articles that you wrote that were kind of about politics and the faith. And I thought that they were both interesting just because I think like the first one, you kind of started out talking with a pastor that I guess is kind of known more on the right, but you kind of use that more as a setup to leading into talking a little bit about what's happening on kind of the religious left. Why don't we kind of just go from there, kind of to get a kind of overview about those two articles in Substack.
Sure. Yeah, and thank you for having me back. It's always enjoy your podcast. But yes, so I wrote 2 kind of series, Preachers, Prophets, and Politicians, kind of exploring what it means to be prophetic. I do use that in air quotes. And so I started off, the first piece was really more about, the preacher's side of it and their use of social media, especially. So I talked about preacher Josh Howerton, has a very large following. I think he has more than 1 million followers on Twitter, X, a large social media following, YouTube, all that stuff. And I have family members who attended his church for a long time, and just more and more over the years, it became more partisan. It became more just kind of a coarse tribal atmosphere and kind of culminated in Howerton preaching, just being explicit about it, of like that, Christians should vote for Donald Trump. And that got him even more attention and more praise. That seemed to many to just kind of fuel that ego of now he's got this massive platform that's even more massive, and he's become a figure on the Christian right. And that just kind of fuels itself. And so I talked about Dr. Richard Beck's recent article, and Dr. Beck, Richard Beck, he was a professor of mine at ACU. I think he's probably fairly well. I think I've heard him referenced in other podcasts.
I really liked his. What was his book? Was it Hunting Magic Eels? It just came out it was a few years ago, and really, I'm looking. I guess he has a new one coming out that I want to read. So
yeah, he's a wonderful person. Can attest him personally, but your audience is probably fairly familiar with him. But no, he is on the more. He's an elder back in the church, I believe, still in the Churches of Christ. He's still at ACU. More fairly theologically conservative church, but he's more on the left himself. But he wrote what I think was a very insightful piece about if it's popular, it's not Christian. And his argument is basically if the bigger the following, the more massive the social media following and the platform, the less likely it is that you're encountering authentic, real Christian content, because that audience capture dynamic is always there. The bigger the platform, the more the temptation to kind of speak to, one tribal audience. It rewards you with the clicks and likes and subscribes, especially when you're talking about, pay, when money becomes involved, we have like paid subscribers to Substack, or you have, monetizing your YouTube or book sales or what have you. There's just that temptation to, really dial up your rhetoric, because, we all know this on social media, the more enraging it gets, the more engagement it gets. So if you are skilled at, enragement, you will get more engagement. And so then you'll have a larger following. And so Beck's, premises that, if you see someone with a large following, there's a chance that it's maybe more of a tribal audience capture, an actual thoughtful, discussion. And so that was kind of my, basis for the rest of the article, just talking about, you see this, especially on the right, it's very prominent just because the religious right is just larger and more prominent, more dominant. And examples abound, but kind of what I was trying to also get at was, because there's been so much focus on the right, I think it's led to the religious left kind of excusing bad behavior of their own and excusing some tribalistic behavior. And you see that examples like, John Pavlovitz, who's a very prominent progressive social media presence, who, claims a Christian mantle, but is spreading conspiracy theories about the 2024 election, that Kamala Harris actually won, and just very contemptuous social media. But that sometimes gets excused because, we have to pay attention to the right. And so that's kind of where I was going with that. And I had a few different examples, but that's kind of an overview of the first one.
Yeah, I actually want to talk a little bit more about John Pavlovitz, because he is someone that I see a lot on social media, and gets a lot of attention.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just funny. A lot of what he writes is, as you've said, is very contemptuous. It's very mean-spirited. And I'm always surprised that he is so popular and just kind of comes off. I mean, if it's one of those things that, how we usually will say that if the other side did it, we would not tolerate it, and we wouldn't. But because he's going after the people that we don't like, then it's okay. But it just seems like it just seems wrong. It doesn't seem like how he acts is very Christ-like.
Yeah. And there's also this dynamic of, and I see this too, and it's on the right and the left, but I see it in my own circles, in some of the more progressive spaces I'm sometimes in, of, John Palovitz wrote a book called If Jesus is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, and so there's this weird dynamic of he's preaching, love your enemies, love your neighbor, and then just full blown contempt on social media. And he recently had a whole series called Loathe Your Neighbor, which was poking fun at evangelicals, or, MAGA and conservative evangelicals, claiming that they loathe their neighbor. And so it was just kind of just evangelical bashing, basically. And he had folks like Brian Recker, who is someone we read his book for a small group. And I also, the same dynamic, I would say, is just overflowing with contempt while also preaching like a spirituality of love. And there's just this whole ecosystem that just seems like it's run on contempt. But at the same time, it's this, if God is love, don't be a jerk, and it's a very confusing message, I would say. But yeah, it goes back to evangelical bashing, which I think is exhausting personally. And that's a whole nother topic. But yeah, John Pavlovitz is an interesting character. And, I've seen, in my own life, like I know a progressive pastor who has a very large following himself, who privately, shared with me that he was concerned about Pavlovitz's election conspiracism, but this particular pastor never shared publicly about that. And it's hard not to feel like, well, if a right-wing pastor was, sharing stuff like that, that would get denounced. But, there's this ecosystem of, well, our tribe is righteous and our cause is noble. Therefore, we're going to overlook some of the harmful stuff going on. And I think that's so damaging to credibility of not only those individuals, but just the credibility of the church to be able to have that prophetic voice. Because if you're not criticizing your own side, you're only criticizing the other side. Well, then that just becomes tribal and partisan, not really principled. And I think that's kind of part of the dynamic I was trying to tease out with my column.
What do you think it is that we tend to look at the word, and I mean, it's the word that we, especially on the progressive side, will use a lot, is the word prophetic. And, it's kind of like the phrase from The Princess Bride, that you keep using that word, but I don't think you know what it means. Because we hear a lot of what it means to be prophetic, but usually it feels like it's you're saying the things that I agree with, and B, it's against the other guy. But that's not the image of a prophet in the Bible, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, we look at the prophets in the Bible, Jeremiah and Isaiah, and and obviously Jesus being one of them, there's always a real cost. Sometimes it's their life, and Paul and just, the apostles, like there's a cost. There's a real heavy cost to being prophetic. You are telling people things they don't want to hear. And so, but you are standing on, your, moral convictions and what you believe is right. And so you're speaking that truth, sometimes truth to power, often truth to power, but it's something that they don't want to hear. And it's very uncomfortable. And it comes with a real cost. Whereas a lot of times on social media, it's, you're sharing something that you know will get lots of likes and clicks and engagement. And sure, you might get also pushback, but like that just also feeds into the whole cycle of, well, if people are enraged online, then that just brings up the algorithm even more and rewards that. So there's this tendency to say, oh, I'm getting pushback on social media, therefore, there's a cost associated with it. But like that's not the same thing as, losing your livelihood or even your life, or having the real cost, losing relationships, friendships, compared to, I'm spewing hot takes on Twitter all the time, and like sometimes people get mad. So yeah, I think people have to I think we overuse the word prophetic. Not everything is prophetic. And a lot of times people label things that are as prophetic when it's really just, I like your hot take.
What do you think is the reasoning? And you kind of talk about this with audience capture and how people are kind of always going after the likes, the clicks. I mean, kind of what does that say in how we talk about politics, and how do we kind of balance that? Because I think that is a problem these days with social media, is that there is always that allure for virality, but there's also that it's a double-edged sword, because then you can't ever be critical of your own side. And I mean, I guess I wonder, how does that harm Christian witness?
Yeah, there was a really good piece in Christianity Today recently. I want to say it's Christianity. I believe it was "Urgency is not faithfulness."
Mm-hmm.
It's talking about, this impulse to have a take on everything, to need to speak out, to say, something happens, we have to respond right away. And I've seen this in pastors where, the longer it takes for them to think things through, the more thoughtful, the more even-handed, the more, just, I would say, a little more Christian their writing is. A book, it takes a long time. You got to think through things. It's a little more, you know, it's not just in the moment. It's speaking like kind of like eternal truths, and sermons can also be, they're also take longer times. They may take several weeks, obviously more than I do, but that you have to sit with it. You have to think through it. Like what am I trying to say? Work through all of that. Often in the process of writing, you're also coming to your own understandings. And the end result is just more thoughtful. But on Twitter, it's just instantaneous.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that first thought, and it's typically, your lizard brain kicking in, and I'm going to fire off this tweet. And that's, on the timeline, if one end is like a book and then a little closer is a sermon, well, on the other end, instantaneous is social media. And it's often not thoughtful. It's often not measured, or, it's just like a hot take. And that's where I think, people really get into trouble. And I don't know what like the good balance is, but my opinion is, I think pastors should probably be less engaged on social media versus more, because it's just all the incentives are bad. That like it rewards contempt and judgmentalism and moralism and binary us versus them thinking. It does not reward thoughtfulness. Basically, it does not reward the fruits of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
It does not reward love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. It just does not reward self-control, And so I don't know how constructive having a large social media following can really be. you see some folks, maybe like Russell Moore or, David, some people, there's some examples out there. People I think are, thoughtful, but it's all the incentives are bad. So it's, and I think I was talking to a friend of mine who's a pastor up in Chicago, close friend, known him since college. And his thoughts, and I've kind of come to a similar conclusion of, pastors, they're first and foremost should be focusing on the local church, their church, their congregation. Like, what does their congregation need? What is, the pain points, the needs, everything going on with like what is right in front of them. And when you try to become, a national pundit that's always spouting off hot takes, your attention is being directed elsewhere. It's being directed, and often it's being directed toward things that you really cannot control too much. You can fire off endless hot takes about this, that, the other, current news event. Is that really making a huge difference compared to you have people right in front of you in your pews to focus on who could use your time and attention and resources? But that time and attention is being diverted into social media. And I don't think it's a very healthy dynamic. And so my pastor friend up in Chicago that's where he's landed, is that, really it should be almost exclusively the local church, and anything outside that can be a real distraction.
Yeah. I mean, I think, obviously part of my work is as a communications, besides being a pastor, of social media, but I've learned a lot about these days trying to think before I post, and maybe posting in ways that try to be more thoughtful about stuff and not just a hot take. Because good Lord, I do see a lot of stuff. There is someone that I know that it was a pastor, was very, I think, thoughtful. And I don't know if it's just because this person is now retired or whatever. Obviously, it's much more on social media than they used to be. Good Lord, they kind of say things that are just like,
right.
No, you shouldn't be saying this. You should, no, I mean, and it's one thing to have an opinion. I think that, but even there, you have to be careful how you do that. I don't want to go as far as saying pastors shouldn't be on social media, but I feel like for some reason, as a pastor, there is a burden of being responsible, of being the grown up. And sometimes we just don't do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. And also, I mean, obviously, with your platform, like, these are constructive conversations, but they're about things that impact people's lives. It's not just, we're going to be Fox News, MS Now, style shows back and forth. It's like, let's talk through these issues together. But to your point about, sorry, there was something I wanted to say about your last point.
Of pastors and social media, or think before you post.
Yeah, think before you post. Yeah, I thought I'll come back to it.
Well, I think it is. I do see a lot of pastors when I would follow TikTok, which I have to say, just being a crotchety Gen Xer, I don't get it. But, people who just kind of do all the stuff on TikTok or Reels or whatever. And there are pastors that do that. But it's too much of an influencer. And I don't think that that's really helpful, because you're playing to an audience, but you're not. I don't think that that's part of your role as a pastor is supposed to be to that local, as you said, that local congregation that needs your pastoring, that needs for you to tend to. It's not a bunch of the people out there. I mean, and I think, you also have to wonder, have to think about how important is that to you, and how much is that going to cost you? Because there are probably things I could do that could make more people read my Substack or make people listen to this podcast. But one, it's a lot of work to do that. And two, it would be doing things that I just don't think are very Christian. And I just don't want to do that.
Yeah, I remember what I was going to say, and it's to the point of, pastoring people. There's also this danger of when a pastor is constantly on social media adding all this contempt, you're pastoring people.
Yep.
You're discipling people in, like, this is the way you engage with the world. When you are constantly firing off hot takes about, the crazy libs or the right wingers, you are discipling people. Like, this is how you engage with that tribe. Or just engage with the world in general. Like, this contempt is okay. Well, my pastor is out there on social media spouting off hot takes and getting into fights, on Twitter. It's like, this is perfectly acceptable. And it's even worse when it's kind of framed as like, oh, this is Jesus' work. This is justice work. And it's like, it's not though. Being a self-righteous jerk online is not Jesus' work. But yeah, and I have seen that in my own life where I see people who sometimes even in like church leadership positions, they're like small group leaders or what have you, and their social media is just contempt, and you can almost draw a direct line to like who they're following, and like, oh, you are mirroring this person online that is also spouting this contempt, and it works for them, so you can do that as well. It's just damaging all around.
I wanted to actually move to the second part, your second article, because I thought that was interesting too. And you kind of focus a lot on James Tallarico, who is the Texas, I want to make sure, state senator that is actually running for the U.S. Senate from Texas.
He's a state rep. Yeah.
Oh, he's a state rep. Okay. I don't know why. Okay.
But he is running for U.S. Senate.
Yes. And we'll know in a few weeks what could be an interesting matchup in a few months, because he could be running against the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who is interesting as a candidate. But you kind of talk a little bit about his role in what is he, how he kind of presents himself, what's kind of all behind that. And I think it's interesting. You were very honest in saying that, if it comes down to between him and Paxton, you know who you're voting for, and it's not Paxton. But that there is some cost to what he's doing or how he's presenting himself. Could you kind of give an overview of that second article?
Yeah, I think James Tallarico presents an interesting case study. He is he was a teacher for a long time. He has been in seminary at Austin Presbyterian, I want to say. And so he is preparing for seminary, but also he put that on hold to run for higher office. And so he does bring, that seminarian ground to his work. And he is very open about, his Christian faith and puts that a part of like his campaign messaging. So it'll be an interesting dynamic in Texas where we have Ken Paxton, who's the Texas Attorney General, and he has numerous scandals. His wife has filed for divorce. He was impeached by the Texas House, which is dominated by Texas Republicans. This was his own side that decided we have too much, but he was not convicted by the Senate, so he remained in office. Needless to say, he is, has lots of character issues that are on display. But he's also one that Ken Paxton is also someone who, proclaims Christian faith and uses that often in his own messaging. And so it'll be an interesting dynamic of Paxton versus Tallarico. And so, Tallarico, in the sense of just basic decency, presents a stark contrast. That's what David French was arguing in his New York Times op-ed recently. But it just comes down to basic human decency. Tallarico is a clear winner. On that note, I think David French is right. And David French got a lot of blowback from that. I think some of that is hypocritical for the right, who's supported politicians like Trump and mixing and saying that like he has his own Christian witness, and baptizing some of the rhetoric as somehow anything related to the Gospels, to then to give him a pass and then critique Tallarico is hypocritical. So that being said, so I started off the piece with what I think is an interesting quote from James Tallarico's pastor, who's also a mentor. Jim Rigby is a very prominent figure in James Tallarico's life. He married his parents. He baptized James Tallarico. He has been James Tallarico's pastor. He's definitely his spiritual mentor. But there's a quote that appeared in Texas Monthly profile that I think was excellent. And it's called The Last Temptation of James Tallarico. But this quote from Rigby is kind of what I think was kind of the frame for the piece. And here's a quote from the article. Rigby didn't tell Tallarico outright what to do, but he did explain that choosing the politician's path would not be the prophetic one, that it would come with certain pitfalls. The prophets, he said, were not fortune tellers, but rather interpreters of the political situation of their time. They also gave up political power to maintain their purity. A politician never gets to choose between pure good and pure evil, Rigby recalled saying. When you have power and you're supposed to be negotiating between two different sides, there's no purity, which is why the prophets surrendered power. And so, Tallarico obviously didn't take that particular path. He chose a politician's path. He put seminary on hold and ran for higher office, first for this being a state rep, and then now running for U.S. Senate. But I think Jim Rigby gets it right on this count that these are two different paths. There is the politician's path. There is the prophet's / pastor's path. They're not the same. There is not overlap. You cannot wear both of those hats. I think a lot of people, we see this very commonly on the right, where there is a sense of, they're being, they're a politician, but they're also being a prophet. Like, well, those are two different things. But now on the left, there's that same tendency of like, this is a uniquely Christian witness. And I guess my point is that Tallarico's a politician. We have to evaluate what he says based on that. And so, if you've been in Texas, you've seen a lot of these ads. I think Tallarico has a lot of admirable qualities. I was very impressed with his Joe Rogan interview. I was very impressed with his Ezra Klein interview. But once you're in partisan politics, you're running for higher office, that colors all of your statements. They have to be evaluated through that filter. When you are a politician, you're trying to win votes. So you're going to avoid saying things that will lose you votes and say things that will win you votes. And so, it's very basic, but it feels like some people have forgotten that. And, if you've lived in Texas as long as I have, you've seen these cycles every few years where there is a figure, who's a rising star, on the left, and there's a message about bridging divides, coming together, and like that's a beautiful, wonderful message. But I think Beto O'Rourke, who ran back in 2018 and then again governor in 2022, is a great example of this because, in 2018, the messaging was, let's cross divides. I voted for Beto at the time because I thought I really liked his message. He was doing Facebook Lives with Republican Congressman Will Hurd. He was doing lots of like outreach and just lots of great moments of like, we need to transcend politics. We need to come together, build bridges, work together. Great messaging. That was 2018. 2020, he runs for president, and it's hell yes, we're taking your AK-47s. It's the messaging almost overnight completely changes. Now it's tribalistic. Now it's we are in a war. We are, us versus them. And it's like, well, yes, when he was running for U.S. Senate in Texas, he's trying to win over a red state. When he's running for president in the Democratic primary, he's trying to win over Democratic primary voters. Those are two different audiences, two different messages, same person. So that's kind of the background of a lot of this, where, we have to evaluate people based on being a politician. And so to just kind of ignore that and say like, well, he's speaking, one way, I think that's a problem.
I think one of the things that you kind of mentioned and you talk about in that article is just also, and it comes with the territory, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it complicates matters, is that a politician has to make compromises. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the job, or at least it should be part of the job. And it just also seems like with being a politician that you also sometimes end up not always telling everything or telling the truth about everything. And I think you include something that I think was in the Texas Monthly article about him not receiving any PAC money, but yet also receiving money from the widow of Sheldon Adelson, which is confusing in many ways. And it just is, that kind of goes against at least the image that you're trying to project. And I think that also leads to another observation is that, and you find this on the right too, so I'm not just faulting Tallarico, but when you try to kind of inject religion into all of this, you're kind of creating this image, and it's a projection, but it may not always be the truth. And I wonder about that sometimes with Tallarico, and with other politicians too, but I just think that since he's kind of up front right now, it's just there, but you see this with politicians on the right too, who are projecting one thing, but then, are just total hypocrites in many ways.
Yeah. And I like when you're dealing with politicians, you should understand that they are saying what they want you to hear. They're saying, what they think will win them votes. And so the example you mentioned, Tallarico's big thing is going up against billionaires. That's a very common messaging on the left is about billionaires, and especially, PAC money, not taking super PAC money. But when you go back to his most recent campaign, his biggest donor, as you mentioned, was Miriam Adelson, Sheldon Adelson's widow, who's a major fundraiser for the GOP and for Trump, very closely aligned with Trump. And their money comes from casinos, just a huge casino empire. And so obviously Miriam Adelson would like for casino gambling, legalized gambling, to come to Texas, for that to be allowed. And Texas is a huge market, and they would love to introduced casino gambling here in the Lone Star State. And so around the time that Talrico gets this, you know, I think it was $59,000, which, for an individual is a lot of money. For a campaign, that's it's not as much. It's not so much the amount, but just the fact that like it took Miriam Allison's money. And at the time, Miriam Allison is trying to get casinos into Texas, and there were bills that were up for a vote, and Talrico voted in favor of a bill that would have expanded legalized gambling into the state of Texas. And so what some folks have pointed out is, you can only imagine if Talrico's opponent had done that. You can only imagine if Talrico's opponent had, taken Miriam Allison's money and then voted in ways that would seem to benefit Miriam Allison. There would be talks about, this is not what Love Your Neighbor looks like. Well, there's a quote from a story comes from an anti-gambling advocate, Les Bernal. He says, the one word that comes to mind to describe his position would be hypocrisy, said Les Bernal, the executive director of Stop Predatory Gambling, national group that advocates against legal gambling. Quote, if he is studying the gospel, he must miss the reading where Jesus says, love others like I love you. Casino gambling, especially, is a prime example of loving yourself more than your neighbor because it's a business based on greed, manipulation, and exploitation. So it's like gambling is, it's can become predatory. It disproportionately affects, the poor, the marginalized. This is something that seems to go against Talrico's values, you would think. But the messaging remains, I'm standing up to billionaires, and also saying, I haven't taken a dime of corporate PAC money, which is technically true. Technically true, but because Miriam Allison's PAC is an advocacy PAC. It's it's according to IRS, it's categorized differently. But the average voter is not going to make that distinction. And so, but these are kind of things. This is the bread and butter of politicians. This is how politicians operate. But when we come from Talrico, where the messaging is, it seems to be one of like, I am more pure. I am, I'm not like those other politicians. My message is one of Christian faith. Christian faith is the bleeding heart of my campaign, and Jesus directs everything that I'm doing. Well, that just causes all kinds of confusion because it's just messing with the message. It's like Jim Rigby said, his pastor, there's no purity in that. You can't be a prophet and be a politician because you're going to make compromises. You're going to be tempted with all kinds of ways every single day to make compromises, not just like, legislative compromises. Compromise your character, compromise your ethic, compromise your values, and it's going to be very difficult to resist that temptation. But when you're a politician, like that's the air we breathe, unfortunately. And so to claim that and then also claim to be prophetic it raises issues for me, is what I was trying to get at in the.
Yeah, personally, I'm not against gambling per se, but I am concerned about the proliferation. I would have been concerned about legal gambling, as in that example in Texas in that way. And I think that there are social costs to it. And I think the danger is that you can, on the one hand, talk about caring for the poor and justice and making that from a religious standpoint, but then also supporting this bill and taking money from a PAC that was, basically expanding gambling in a state where there are lots of poor people and all of that. So it's just kind of like, yeah, you can't, no,
Yeah.
that doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to choose one or the other.
Yeah. I think something that also rubs people the wrong way is the way Talarico's messaging is very moralizing. It's very black. I mean, it's talk about transcending differences, but there's a lot of those people have the wrong Christianity. My people have the right Christianity. We're doing things right. They're doing things wrong. They don't care about these groups. I do. And so it's when you become that, you know, righteous and moralizing, but then you also have all these things going on behind the background where no, but you're also compromising a lot, and you're, it really rubs people the wrong way. I think just the messaging, to me, it feels like it lacks humility, and it also portrays, those. It feels like there's just a lot of those people, even though the messaging is transcending differences.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of those people have corrupted Christianity. I'm doing it right. That kind of messaging. So yeah.
How, oh, I don't know how aware you are of Adam Hamilton. He's a United Methodist pastor.
Okay. I'm not super familiar.
Okay. The reason I ask, because he is pastor of a church in just outside of Kansas City, Church of the Resurrection. Very large. I think it's the largest United Methodist church, about 20,000 members. And maybe in March, he shared a video that he was thinking about running for Senate in Kansas, and initially was going to run as an independent, and is now actually going to be running as a Democrat. And I'm just kind of interested to see where that will go, because I think one of his hallmarks has always been about reaching across differences, especially ideological differences. And his church does have people from across the ideological spectrum. But I also wonder where kind of in the campaign, and I think the Kansas GOP has already been hitting him hard. They're also showing their own hypocrisy as well. But I just also wonder where the compromises will come in, because, his whole thing is that he wants to be an independent-minded politician. But I also know that the times that we are in is that you really can't be that. And so I'm just kind of curious where that will go, where that will end up. And I'm kind of working on something to write about on that. So I was just curious.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think kind of another element similar to that is, whenever pastors run for higher office, I think it's just a tricky dynamic. But one of the pieces I mentioned in my essay was a Texas Tribune article about Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico and how their churches had formed them. But it talks about Jasmine Crockett was the House rep who ran against James Talarico and lost, but still had a pretty good showing. But in her church, she is running for elected office, and in her church, there's a lot of political messaging, and even in the the hallway outside the sanctuary, they were doing voter registration drives. And that feels like an especially, questionable mixing of politics and religion right there. But then you also have the pastor is running to take Jasmine Crockett's seat. And so you have the pastor who is running for elected office, who is also sharing political messaging from the pulpit, who is also running voter drives in the lobby of the church. That seems like a big mess, and that's the kind of stuff where there's just too much intermingling of politics and religion. It's hard for me to imagine, like, the prophetic voice of the church, if they're going to speak out against, the right, which is totally fine. If you're speaking about injustice and things happening on the right, but now it just has this completely different message to it. It just comes across as partisan campaigning. It's not prophetic, because now it's like, oh, well, this is a church we're all working to elect our pastor to be the Democratic representative of the House, and so that's another dynamic in there too.
In kind of talking with all this, what is, though, the image of what it means to actually be prophetic?
Yeah, I think at the end of my piece, I talked about Martin Luther King, who is what a lot of people think of as just the ultimate example of being prophetic, and for a good reason. He spoke truth to power in ways that were uncomfortable. He definitely, he paid the ultimate price eventually, but also just during his ministry, all kinds of threats and a real cost. But it was a righteous cause, and he spoke truth to power even when it was uncomfortable, even to his own side. What I talked about was, Martin Luther King, right after he's achieved all this success with President Johnson, LBJ has ushered in, the civil rights legislation, landmark legislation that is opening all kinds of opportunities. It really is justice. It is codifying, equality in the full expression of what Martin Luther King was trying to bring about. And at the same time, within a few years, at the same time, the Vietnam War is happening. And the Vietnam War, there are casualties lining up. There are stories about, what's happening in Vietnam in our name, all kinds of things that you would view as unchristian, as far as some of the atrocities going on over there. And it's war, and it's all kinds of things that King thought was objectionable, and he said so, and he spoke out about that too. He spoke out against LBJ, the man who had just years before signed in landmark legislation that was the culmination of his dream, of his vision. But like that's what it looks like to be prophetic. It doesn't matter if it's your side, the other side, your party, the other party. You speak out, and even when it has a real cost to it. And I think, MLK, we admire him for so many reasons, but I think that's a huge part of it too. Of like, he also spoke out against the Vietnam War and what was happening, and spoke out against the Johnson administration, which just shows his character. It shows, that he was willing to say that. And so what I also mentioned was, you can think about a way, what if MLK had run for office? What if he had run for US? I'm well aware that, MLK's church, Raphael Warnock is now, the senator for Georgia. But if MLK had taken that path, is he going to be as willing to speak out against the president? He may have bills he needs to pass. He may have constituencies. There may be, military contractors in his district. He may have all kinds of stakeholders and interest groups and people vying for his attention. Is he going to be able to speak out against that? Is he going to have the same prophetic voice? Maybe, but it's also likely that would be just too much for any person. And so that's why, I don't think pastors and politicians mix. So yeah, I would say MLK is just a great example, not just for what he did as far as civil rights, but also what he did as far as speaking truth to power, no matter who it was.
Well, I would love to continue this conversation. I have to
Okay.
have a heart out, but if people want to learn more, where should they go?
Yeah, they can find me on Substack, Ryan's Boring Book Club. I talk about books and sometimes have occasional author interviews and also talk about stuff like this.
Well, Ryan, this was great. I do want to have you back at some point. But this was a good conversation because I think at some point we also need to just talk a little bit more about what does it look like to be prophetic, and because I think there's just a lot of confusion all around, and we need to really kind of realize what that looks like. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, take care.
All right, you too. Bye.
So, as usual, I'm always curious to know what you are thinking, what you thought about what Ryan said. I wish I had time to have had him stay on a little bit longer. Unfortunately, this was one of those weird days where I actually had back-to-back interviews. So um, I was the one that was kind of needed a heart out. So I hope I can get him back on to chat sometime in the near future. But if feel free to share your opinions, and you can do that by sending me an email at churchandmain@substack.com. I do post these sometimes on my Substack, and so also feel free to leave a comment there when this ends up on Substack. I will include links to both of the essays that he wrote, and I'm also going to include a third one from Ryan that I think it's sort of apropos to what we were talking about. It's also kind of apropos to this evening. I'm recording this on May 21st. This actually happens to be the last. This happens to be the evening where we will have the last episode of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And back in February, Ryan wrote an article called that had the title "Don't Make Colbert a Free Speech Martyr," and I think it's kind of, like I said, fitting. And I say that knowing that I think Stephen Colbert can be very funny. I actually appreciate his deep faith. He is a Catholic by nature. But I will also say I do agree with some of the criticisms that Ryan brings up about that kind of relate to what we're talking about here. So I will include that article, make of it what you will, but that will be also included in the show notes. Also, when it comes to this podcast, if you want to learn more, you want to listen to past episodes, or even donate, you can go to churchandmain.org. And you can also go to churchandmain.substack to read related articles. I have two new ones that just came up recently. The first one is on the crisis of ecclesiology in mainline Protestant churches. And then I have a new one up that just came up maybe on the 16th of May. And then I have one that just went up a few days ago, kind of giving some thoughts about the recent Louisiana primary where Senator Bill Cassidy, who is a Republican, lost in that primary. He came in third. And relating the kind of context between politicians and pastors about being brave. So you can check those out by going to churchandmain.substack.com. And also, like I said, I do tend to put the podcast episodes, they show up usually a little bit later than when they show up on Podbean, but they do show up there. And you can also become a paying subscriber when you go on Substack and make a donation there. I don't put anything behind a paywall, partially just because I know for a lot of people, especially these days, if you can't afford something, it's just hard when there's a lot of good stuff and then you have to have another paywall. And then, especially on Substack, there seems to be 10 million good Substacks and you want to read them all, but then you can't read half of them because you got to pay a subscription. So the becoming a paying subscriber is voluntary. I would love if you did, but you don't have to. But just to let you know. Also, there is a link in the show notes if you want to make a one-time donation, and a link if you want to have any new episode end up in your email inbox. I hope that you will remember to rate and review this episode on your favorite podcast app. That actually allows others to find this podcast. So that's it for this episode of Church in Maine. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. As I like to say, thank you so much for listening. Take care, everyone. Godspeed. And I will see you very soon.